Hey everybody, how you doing? This is Dan Blanchard with the Travel and Time with Dan Show, where we mix travel with history, with leadership, and of course me, Dan Blanchard. Today I'm in Washington, D.C. at the Supreme Court. The Washington Supreme Court, it wasn't always right here in Washington. Started off in New York, went to Pennsylvania, Philly for 10 years, and then it came here to D.C. in 1800, right? Unfortunately, this started off with a history of no respect, the Rodney Dangerfield, no respect, no respect. It didn't even have its own building. For 145 years, it had to be in other places, okay? Now, you might have heard of a guy named Alexander Hamilton. In his Federalist number 78, he says that the judiciary branch is the least dangerous branch. All they do is judge. They don't do anything besides judge, right? Article 3 of the Constitution that creates the judiciary branch in the Supreme Court only has 3 sections. That's right. The legislative, Article 1, the legislative, the legislature creating Congress, they have 10 sections, right? The Supreme Court only has 3 sections. And they said that much of it's going to be figured out later through legislation. All right. So again, no respect for the Supreme Court, sadly, in the beginning. But what happens is that there's the Judiciary Act of 1789, where there were 6 judges. I know today there's 9, it was only 6 back then. And it also said that the judges, because they didn't really have any work to do, they had to go circuit riding. They hated circuit riding in those stagecoaches all over the place, beating themselves up, no sleep, hot, cold, wet. Oh gosh, it was terrible. They hated it. All right, and they said it just basically just lacked prestige. It was a hard life. They hated doing it, and they had nothing to do when they were here. Right? There was very, very little to do, almost no real power, and they were losing their prestige, losing their money, losing their power, and a lot of them were just like, why are we doing this? It ain't worth it. I don't know why we're doing this. All right, so John Jay, he was the very first Chief Justice. He actually resigned because it was such a miserable job with no respect and no prestige. He resigned for the New York governor position. Who would do that? He did, because the New York governor position was considered better than the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. That's wild. And later in 1800, that was in Philadelphia, and later in 1800, when they were bringing it to Washington, D.C., John Adams pulled him aside and said, hey, I need you back. I need you to be Chief Justice again. And he was like, no way, man. I'm not doing that. He even famously stated that the court lacked, ready, energy, weight, and dignity. That's right, that's what he said to President Adams. So President Adams had to go looking for somebody else. And who does he get? The extremely multi-talented John Marshall, who kind of didn't want to do any of this stuff, but he felt he was a patriot, and when he was asked to serve, he just kind of felt like he had to do it. He actually served in all 3 branches, the legislative, judicial, and executive. He served in all 3 branches, and he's going to transform the Supreme Court, the judiciary branch, is going to transform it into a co-equal branch of government. No one thought it could be done, but he does it. And one of the big things he does is in 1803, he's kind of in between a rock and a hard spot, and he definitely comes out with what's called judicial review, where he declares, right, that he's got legislative and executive acts, he can oversee them and say they're unconstitutional now. So now through the judicial review, it's kind of sort of a new thing. He's got the last word on the constitutionality of something that the other branches do. Wow, that just changed the game completely, totally changed the game. And then later on, right, in 1819, you got McCulloch versus Maryland. Right? He's going to come up with the necessary and proper cause. It doesn't say anywhere in the Constitution the United States can have a bank, but guess what? It's what's implied. It needs to be done to run this country. We can have a bank. Oh, and by the way, just because the bank is in your state doesn't mean you can tax it, right? States can't tax the federal government. And this is going to give the federal government more power. It's going to give the judiciary branch more power. Now, eventually, there's a thing called Worcester versus Georgia in 1832. Some of you might have heard of the Trail of Tears. They came out and they told President Jackson that you cannot remove the Indians like that, or the Native Americans. You can't do it. Well, guess what? He does it. He says, hey, you guys, Supreme Court, you guys did your job of judging whether or not it was constitutional. My job is to enforce it, and I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to enforce it. Wow, that's scary. What about checks and balances, huh? When you get a president that does that, it kind of blows checks and balances up, and that's what this country and our democracy is based on, is the checks and balances. A couple of the big cases that are coming later on, you got the Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, where they're going to desegregate the schools. That's huge. 1974, it's huge. You got the United States versus Richard Nixon, where they say, hey, guess what? You got to turn those tapes over. Right? You got to turn those tapes over, and not even the president is above the law. That's a big deal, right? That comes down from the Supreme Court, right? That's a big deal. So some people say, hey, listen, those Supreme Court justices are always wearing those black robes. Like, what's that about? Well, those black robes are supposed to symbolize equality, neutrality, and impartiality. That's why they wear those black robes. That's what they're symbols of. Equality, neutrality, and impartiality. All right? Now, you guys know when I do my travel and time with Dan shows, I mix travel with history, with leadership, and of course with me, Dan Blanchard. This right here kind of looks a little bit like a Greek Parthenon. This is like really, really cool looking. You've got to come down and see it. Matter of fact, come down and see anything at all in Washington, D.C. You won't be sorry. A lot of free stuff. So cool, this place. I've already given you a little bit of the history of the Supreme Court here in the Judiciary branch. So what's the leadership? The leadership is this. Leadership requires independence and courage. And that's what the Supreme Court had to do, right? When they were being dissed and nobody was giving them respect, they just had patience and they just kept doing the right thing over and over and over again, kept showing their independence, kept showing their courage, and eventually they're going to become a co-equal branch. Good for you guys. Good for you guys. That's the way to put checks and balances back in order. All right, everybody. Thanks for spending time with me today on the Travel and Time with Dan show, where we mix travel with history and leadership, and of course me, Dan. I'll be back real soon with another great episode somewhere else. You take care. See you then. See you later.